In this final lesson, looking at the reign of Henry VII, we're going to focus on religion, humanism, arts, and learning, looking at the period in which we start to see the encroaching development of the Renaissance. We see a certain sense of religious stability with a little bit of the idea of potential tensions taking place in the background, but of course nowhere near the kind of things that we start to see with the break from Rome under the reign of Henry VIII. And we'll talk about the idea of arts and learning as well. So again, this was a period of time in which we see quite a number of significant developments, political, social, and cultural changes. Now, from the perspective of religion, of course, we're talking about essentially medieval England or very early modern England. And the result is that religion is still a very central part of this life in England. And Henry VII's reign saw a continuation of the influence of the Catholic Church. This will become very important later in future lessons' time. There were some early signs that there may be change, but that would be more pronounced under Henry VIII, of course. The extent to which there would ever have been a break from Rome had Henry VIII not wanted to secure a divorce is, of course, a debatable question. It's ultimately a very debatable question, but it goes without saying that there is definitely a shift away from the traditional Catholic practices, regardless of what happens under Henry VIII, because of the impact of the Renaissance, the fact that the Reformation in Europe does still happen, and the fact that there is an increase in the kind of arts and learning and social cultures that is slightly different to that of the Catholic Church. But at this stage, within the reign of Henry VII, the Catholic Church is still a very dominant force within England. They control both spiritual and temporal matters. The Pope is still the head of the Church, and his authority is still widely acknowledged. The church is still in control of considerable amounts of wealth, considerable amounts of land, and considerable amounts of influence. Additionally, Henry VII remains quite strongly in relations with the church, has a quite strong relationship with the Catholic Church, as it helped to stabilize his rule. For example, after the defeat of Richard III, the Battle of Bosworth, Henry VII sought to legitimize his reign and to secure his support from religious establishment, and he used religion as a way to essentially strengthen his political authority and to gain the backing of the clergy. In terms of, in 1486, Henry VII did secure the Pope's blessing for his marriage to Elizabeth of York, which united the warring houses of the Lancastrians and the Yorkists. The Pope's support for this marriage was vital in solidifying Henry's claim to the throne. We haven't spoken about the Pope very much, or the Catholic Church very much, in this series of lessons. But if you think back to our understanding of foreign policy, our lessons on foreign policy, and we spoke about the fact that one of Henry's main aims as ruler during his reign through foreign policy was to secure international legitimacy for his reign. Now, this can be seen in relation to Spain and with relation to France as well, but you could also make reference to the Pope and to the papacy as well. The Pope was a very powerful figure in Europe at the time, and so securing their blessing, securing his blessing for things like the marriage of Elizabeth of York to Henry is vital in solidifying his claim to the throne. So that blessing there, the Pope's blessing for this marriage, necessarily involved the Pope recognizing Henry as king, which again contributed to his to his desires to be recognized internationally as the true heir to the throne and the true leader and the true king of England. Monastic institutions also remained powerful and influential during Henry's reign. He continued the tradition of supporting religious orders. Monasteries enjoyed a considerable amount of wealth, but by the end of his reign, some criticism of monasteries began to surface, although again, this is not pronounced anywhere near as much as it will be in later years under the reign of Henry VIII. In terms of religious reforms, there are sort of two areas that I want to focus on. Firstly, Henry VII was a devout Catholic himself, and he undertook various different religious acts during his reign. He supported, for example, the building of religious institutions. He funded multiple different pilgrimages, and he made significant donations to the church. But it should be noted that while Henry's reign was not necessarily marked by a widespread amount of heretical movements, there was some undercurrent of what we call lollardry. Lollardry and the Lollards were a movement that criticised Catholic church practices. So this was an undertone within English society at the time that wasn't really addressed too much by Henry. He was cautious about such movements and did take some steps to try and suppress them in terms of maintaining stability, but this undercurrent of heretical movements did still exist. We see that then for sort of evidence of religious development under Henry VII, his marriage to Elizabeth of York being recognised by the Pope as legitimate was a significant interaction between Henry and the papacy, and was a significantly important aspect of his dynasty and his relationship with religion. So too was the significant donations made to the church, things like the commissioning of religious works, funding of things like Westminster Abbey, for example, as well. Moving a little bit away from religion then, what about things like humanism and arts and learning under the reign of Henry VII? Well, first I would like to just ask the question of what humanism actually is. Humanism is an influence and a movement that originated in Italy in the 14th and the 15th centuries, so quite a lot before Henry VII. And during the reign of Henry VII, it began to influence England. Now, ultimately, the idea of humanism is that it was an intellectual movement that emphasized the study of classical texts, the value of human reason, and the idea of individual achievement. It was a sort of somewhat ethereal concept as well, but it's an idea that is linked quite closely with Italy, and then more deeply starting to be associated with Renaissance Italy as well. It had a gradual influence on English thought throughout Henry's reign. We see, for example, that Henry's reign saw the establishment of schools and the promotion of education, although formal humanist education did not become widespread until the reign of Henry VIII. The king himself was interested in learning and in the arts, and supported the foundation of educational institutions. We note as well that while humanism did not take root in England, particularly in this time period, or not as much as it does later on, we do see some humanist thinkers, people like Jean Colet, who would go on to play a prominent role in the development of humanist education, was active during Henry's reign. Colet was educated in Italy and was influenced by humanism. Finally, Henry's diplomatic relations with other European countries, including Italy, allowed for humanist ideas to slowly infiltrate England. The king himself had connections with things like the Italian court and fostered intellectual exchanges. Finally then, let's spend a little bit of time talking about the development of arts and learning. It could be argued that arts and learning flourished during the reign of Henry VII. Though England was not yet at the forefront of the European Renaissance, this would take place later on, Henry was definitely interested in the use of the arts as a means for consolidating power and displaying the grandeur of his new dynasty. For example, he supported the arts through things like painting and sculpture and architecture. He commissioned the works that would project his power and legitimacy, the legitimacy of the Tudor dynasty. For example, he commissioned the building of the Lady Chapel at Westminster Abbey, which was completed in 1519 and served as a symbol of Tudor power. In terms of portraiture, i.e. the use of portraits. This also grew during the reign of Henry VII. The portraits of Henry, most famously the work of artist William Scrots, were intended to convey his power and his authority, as well as his calm and his neutered nature. Under Henry's reign as well, a distinctive Tudor style of art would start to emerge, blending elements of the Gothic with the elements of the Renaissance. This was seen in royal commissions, illuminated manuscripts and things like decorative arts. And so ultimately there is a little hint of Renaissance influence during this time. While Henry did not promote a fully fledged Renaissance in England, of course, he supported the early stages of intellectual and artistic growth. Scholars were drawn to his court and took steps to encourage learning. And Henry's court was a centre of culture, with intellectuals and artists receiving royal patronage. And so fundamentally then, if we think about the end of the reign of Henry VII, it should be noted that probably the most important feature of this reign, the most important aspect of this reign, is the fact that he was obsessed with the securing of his dynasty, the securing of the succession, and the maintaining of a large royal treasury in order to do so. There were early signs of humanist thoughts and Renaissance styles as we go into looking at the end of his reign, and ultimately this would flourish more and more under the reign of Henry VIII, under the reign of Elizabeth I as well. In terms of his foreign policy, of course, he was very much obsessed with the idea of maintaining stability, maintaining peace, and maintaining alliances that recognize his dynasty. And one such example of this can be seen when we look at the relationship between Henry and the papacy, his religious relationship with the Pope and the Catholic Church, with the Pope granting blessing for his marriage to Elizabeth of York in 1486.